The deep woods hold many secrets. Some are buried beneath the roots of ancient trees, long forgotten by time. Others lurk in the shadows, waiting for the unlucky ones who dare to step too far into their domain. Tonight, I bring you 5 terrifying true stories from the wilderness. 5 encounters that prove some places should never be explored. So, lock your doors, dim the lights, and prepare yourself for nightmares. Story 1. The Vanishing Footsteps. Jason and Mark were experienced hikers. They had spent years exploring the most secluded parts of the Appalachian Mountains, relishing the silence and the untouched beauty of the wilderness. But in the fall of 2017, they would come face to face with something unnatural, something that should not have existed in those woods. It was their 4th night deep in the forest. The day had been peaceful, their journey mostly uneventful, and by sundown, they had set up camp near a quiet clearing. But as Jason drifted into sleep, something pulled him back to consciousness. At first, he wasn't sure what had woken him. Then, he heard it. Soft, rhythmic crunching, footsteps. He held his breath, listening. It was slow, methodical, human-like, but something about it was off. It was too precise, too deliberate, like someone, or something, was circling their tent. He nudged Mark awake. "You hear that?" Jason whispered. Mark sat up, groggy, rubbing his face. "What?" Then the sound came again, closer. Crunch. Jason reached for his flashlight, his hand shaking. He took a deep breath and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. Nothing. Just darkness and trees. The fire had burned low, casting weak, flickering light across the clearing. There should have been footprints. The ground was damp, covered in soft earth, but the space around their tent was untouched. No tracks, nothing. Mark exhaled, irritated. "Probably just a deer." Jason wasn't convinced. He zipped the tent shut and lay back down, gripping his knife tightly. He forced himself to breathe, to calm his nerves. But just as sleep threatened to take him, the sound returned. Only this time, it was right behind the tent. A whisper, low, guttural, incomprehensible. A voice that didn't belong to any living thing. Jason felt his blood turn to ice. And then, Mark did something stupid. Without warning, he unzipped the tent in one swift motion and shone his flashlight into the night. There was nothing there, just trees. But Jason knew something had been there. Something had been watching. The forest wasn't empty. For the rest of the night, neither of them slept. They sat by the fire, weapons in hand, staring into the trees, waiting, listening. By morning, they packed up and left, abandoning half their gear. When they reached a ranger station, they told their story to a park official. The man's face went pale. He told them about the lost ones, ancient spirits of the woods, souls who had died in isolation and now whispered to those who strayed too far. Jason and Mark never went back. But sometimes, in the dead of night, Jason swears he still hears those whispers. Story 2. The Hunter in the Trees. Eric had been hunting since he was a kid, but nothing could have prepared him for what happened in the Montana wilderness in 2016. He and his uncle, Dave, had picked a remote spot deep in the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness. They wanted somewhere isolated, far from noisy campers or amateur hunters. Just them, their rifles, and miles of untouched forest. For the first 2 days, everything was perfect. They tracked elk, set up camp, and even got a decent kill. But on the 3rd night, something changed. Eric was cleaning his rifle by the fire when Dave suddenly stiffened, staring into the woods. "You hear that?" Dave whispered. Eric froze, listening. At first, all he could hear was the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. Then, he caught it. A whistle. Not a bird, not the wind. A clear human whistle, long and slow, like someone calling out to them. Eric shivered. "Maybe another hunter?" Dave shook his head. "Nobody should be out here. We're miles off the nearest trail." The whistle came again, closer this time. Then, another whistle responded from the opposite direction. A cold dread settled in Eric's stomach. He reached for his rifle. "What the hell is that?" Dave didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed the flashlight and shined it toward the trees. The beam caught something. Eyes. Not one pair, not 2. 4. They were high, too high to be from any normal animal. and they didn't blink. They just stared, unmoving. Then something shifted. One of the figures crawled down the tree head first. Eric's breath hitched. Jesus Christ! Its limbs moved unnaturally, bending in ways they shouldn't. As it got closer, the firelight caught its face, pale, hollow, with a mouth stretched too wide into an unnatural grin. It was humanoid, but not human. Dave acted fast. He grabbed Eric's arm and whispered, "We're leaving." Now? They packed up in record time, grabbing only essentials. The whistling started again, more of them now, all around. As they started moving, the figures followed. Not running, not charging, just watching, trailing them. Every time Eric glanced back, they were closer. The hike back to the truck was the longest 3 hours of his life. The creatures never attacked, never spoke, just whistled and watched. When they finally reached the truck and sped off, Eric made the mistake of looking into the rearview mirror. One of them stood at the edge of the trees, its head tilted, its mouth still twisted into that horrible grin. The last thing he saw was its hand slowly waving goodbye. Eric and Dave never spoke of it again. But Eric still wonders, what if they had stayed another night? Story 3. The cabin that shouldn't exist. Daniel had always loved solo camping. He enjoyed the solitude, the raw connection with nature, the feeling of being completely alone under a vast sky. That's why, in October of 2019, he decided to take a week-long trip into the dense forests of Washington state. No phone, no GPS, just a map, a compass, and his gear. He set up camp near a small river, miles from any marked trails. The first night was peaceful, the kind of stillness he had been craving. But by the second night, something was off. It started with small things. His gear wasn't where he had left it. His boots, which he swore he had placed beside the tent, were now outside, facing the trees. Then, the whispers started. At first, he convinced himself it was just the wind, but the longer he listened, the more certain he became. These weren't random gusts. These were voices, faint, distant, almost melodic. By the third night, Daniel was seriously considering cutting his trip short. That evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, he decided to scout the area just to put his mind at ease. That's when he found it. A cabin. It stood in a small clearing, completely untouched by time. No signs of wear, no overgrown vegetation swallowing it up. Just a perfectly intact wooden cabin in the middle of nowhere. Daniel's stomach tightened. He had studied maps of this area. There were no structures anywhere near here. A sane person would have walked away. But curiosity got the best of him. The door wasn't locked. It creaked open with little effort, revealing a dimly lit interior. Dust covered everything, but there were signs that someone, or something, had been there recently. A fire had been lit in the stone fireplace. A single chair sat in front of it, positioned perfectly as if waiting for someone to return. On the wooden table lay something that made Daniel's blood run cold. A photograph. Of him. It was an old, grainy photo, black and white. He recognized himself instantly, but the setting in the picture was wrong. It wasn't from this trip. It wasn't from any trip. It was from a time that didn't make sense. That was when the whispering stopped. Daniel felt a presence behind him. He spun around, but the cabin was empty. The fire flickered. The single chair rocked slightly, as if someone had just stood up from it. That was all he needed. He bolted, sprinting through the woods without looking back. As he ran, he swore he heard footsteps behind him. Fast, deliberate, matching his pace. It wasn't until he reached his camp that the presence vanished. He didn't sleep. By dawn, he was gone. Days later, when he checked his phone, he found a new photo in his gallery. It was a picture of the cabin, but this time, the chair wasn't empty. The woods hold many mysteries. Some can be explained. Others remain in the shadows, waiting for their next visitor. Would you dare to enter? Story 4. The Man in the Hollow. Ethan and his girlfriend Laura had always been avid hikers, but they were careful about where they went. They stuck to established trails, avoided dangerous wildlife, and never ventured too deep into unknown territory. That changed in the summer of 2021. They were in Oregon, hiking through the thick pine forests of the Cascade Range. The goal was to reach a remote, scenic overlook that was rarely visited. It was supposed to be peaceful, untouched. It was neither. The first sign that something was wrong came about 5 miles in. Ethan spotted something carved into a tree. At first, he thought it was just graffiti from some careless campers, but as he stepped closer, his stomach turned. "Turn back." The words were deep, jagged, and fresh. Laura laughed nervously. "Somebody trying to scare us?" Ethan didn't respond. They kept moving. Half an hour later, they found another carving. "Last chance." This time, the bark was splintered, like something sharp had been used in a hurry. Laura frowned. "Okay, this is actually weird." Ethan felt uneasy too, but they had already come so far. He reassured her that it was probably just a prank. Then, they found the third carving. It wasn't words this time. It was a face. A crude, grotesque face with hollow, sunken eyes and an impossibly wide grin. It stretched across the tree like a twisted warning, and beneath it, a fresh set of footprints led deeper into the woods. Ethan's blood ran cold. The tracks were barefoot. "Laura," he said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper, "we need to leave." She nodded, and they turned around. That's when they heard it. Crunch. A footstep, not theirs. It came from the trees, somewhere behind them. Ethan spun around, scanning the dense forest. Nothing moved, no birds, no wind, just silence. Then, from the direction of the footprints, they heard laughter. Not normal laughter. It was strained, wet, like someone gasping for breath while trying to mimic the sound of human joy. Laura grabbed Ethan's arm, squeezing it tight. "Run," she whispered. They sprinted. Branches tore at their clothes. The world blurred into a tunnel of green as their hearts pounded in sync. But the footsteps followed. Fast. Too fast. Ethan didn't look back. He didn't need to. He could feel it, whatever it was, getting closer. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. They burst out of the woods onto the trailhead, gasping for air. Ethan finally turned. Nothing. Just trees. But then, he saw it. Carved into the tree nearest to them, fresh and still oozing sap, were 3 new words. "See you soon." They never went back. Story 5. The Watcher in the Fog. In the summer of 2020, Ben took a solo backpacking trip through the Great Smoky Mountains. He had done plenty of solo hikes before and always felt at home in the wilderness. But this trip, this one was different. He had planned for 4 days, carrying enough food, water, and gear to last him comfortably. On the second night, as he was setting up camp near a small clearing, a heavy fog began rolling in. Ben didn't think much of it at first. Fog was common in the mountains, but something about this mist felt wrong. It moved too fast. Within minutes, the trees around him were swallowed in a thick, milky haze. The temperature dropped, and an eerie silence settled over the forest. No crickets, no birds, just stillness. Then, a shape emerged. At first, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him, but as he squinted into the fog, he saw it clearly. A tall, thin figure standing just at the edge of visibility. Ben felt his stomach tighten. "Hello?" he called out. No response. The figure didn't move. Ben took a step closer, shining his flashlight. The beam barely cut through the dense fog, but for a split second, it illuminated something. A face. No distinct features. Just dark, sunken pits where the eyes should be. Ben stumbled backward. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. Then, it stepped forward, not walking, gliding. Ben didn't stick around to see more. He grabbed his gear and ran, his lungs burning as he tore through the forest. The fog didn't lift. It clung to him like it was alive. He ran for what felt like hours until he finally saw the flickering glow of his campfire in the distance. He dove into his tent, zipped it shut, and clutched his knife, trembling. Outside, the fog pressed against the fabric of his tent like a living thing. Then came the whisper. "You're not supposed to be here." It was right outside. Ben held his breath, waiting, listening. Then, silence. He didn't sleep that night. By morning, the fog was gone. The woods were normal again. But before he packed up, he noticed something in the dirt right outside his tent. Footprints, not human ones. He hiked back to civilization that day and never went into the Smokies alone again. But sometimes, when the fog rolls in near his home, he swears he still sees that shadowy figure standing just at the edge of his vision, waiting, The deep woods are beautiful, vast, and untamed, but they are also ancient, and they do not belong to us. There are things in the forest we cannot explain, things older than civilization itself. So the next time you find yourself alone in the wilderness and the trees grow too quiet, you might want to start running, because something might already be watching.